Now, another way you can go with this is with the mass hallucination issue, because like mass hallucinations occur, but the problem with mass hallucinations is that you have like a group of people that are really like wanting to see something, and they like don't, the death is in the details. They don't see exactly the same thing. They see basically the same thing. But like if you get into these details of what they saw, they would be all over the place. So like Bart Ehrman, Gerd Ludemann are two historians who like look for that. They look for differences in Christian doctrine as evidence that it was a hallucination. You know, so like basically they all saw Jesus in some vague sense, because that's the kind of mass hallucination that's possible. But they, you know, they were all over the place. So like, yeah, it's unlikely that they all had a mass hallucination, but if there's evidence for it, then like that changes things. The problem is the differences in Christian doctrine are kind of like what we've been talking about. The fact that there was a disagreement over whether the resurrection was physical or spiritual is there. Yeah, that debate existed. Paul talks about it. He, you know, and 1 John 4 straight up talks about it. But again, what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. You can explain that debate just as well, in fact, probably better, with the known Greek predisposition towards a non-physical afterlife and superior existence. Okay, and so given the context of these books and when they were written, that makes more sense, actually. You know, another one that Bart Ehrman breaks up is like, he's like, well, there was a disagreement over the circumcision and following Jewish law, and it's like, well, yeah, but that's to be expected anyway. That doesn't mean that, like, you know, one hallucinated Jesus as saying follow the Jewish law, and another one hallucinated Jesus saying don't. Like, that's going to be an issue for lifelong Jews. Okay. And then, you know, like Gerd Ludemann and these guys, like Bart too, points to like the later disagreements among Christians, and like we talked about that in the video on what did Jesus really teach, about a plausible explanation for why there were so many different Christian groups later on. But as you can see, the process is already underway in the early church. Like, people have existing beliefs and ideas before Christianity emerges, and it emerges into a system, and then they've got to figure out it's pulling on Christianity, you know what I mean? Like, and pulling it in different directions. And then if the gospel's true, a lot of the truth of Christianity, Christian doctrine, was taught to Jesus, to the apostles, after the resurrection. Paul straight up says that. Luke straight up says that that's what Jesus opened up their minds to understand, that he had to die and all that. So, like, he teaches them more after he comes back from the dead. And then, like, there could be an era of trying to figure out exactly how to take all of the facts that Jesus gave us and put them into a coherent system. And that seems to be what's really going on. But anyway, so yeah, there's no evidence for it. Now, you could tell me, well, Ben, you know, I love hallucinogenic drugs, and I think that just because there's no evidence for it today, that doesn't mean we won't find any tomorrow. Okay, but philosophically, that's a problem. Holding out for a conclusion and withholding belief on the basis of evidence you don't have is irrational. You should go with the evidence you have. And a way to illustrate this is, let's say that in the future, 50 years from now, we find good evidence that they didn't hallucinate. Would you be willing to accept that the resurrection happened on the basis that we'll one day find evidence that it didn't happen? No. Like, because you're biased, right? Because you're biased. Like, this, when you're holding out for evidence you don't have, it just shows that you already want to believe something even without evidence, you know. So, like, yes, that's possible that, like, some evidence could come along to, like, falsify the resurrection. They could find the body of Jesus. But given that given that they haven't, a rational person should believe that God raised him from the dead. Okay? And then, it raises serious questions about all the people that have lived and died at this point, and God led them to believe the wrong thing. But anyway, that's a whole other philosophical question that we're not going to get into for the sake of this video, other than just say, like, what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. You know what I mean? Like, that's a double-edged sword. That's a bat that swings both ways. Like, if you're going to hold out for evidence for hallucination theory, all right, well, everybody else gets to hold out for evidence that they were all robots. Or that the resurrection happened. Okay. So now what we need to do is look at combo theories. Because shared delusion disorder it's called folie à deux, and it was for a long time in the actual psychology manuals, and then they took it out as an official thing. But it's been in there for so long that it's got a long history. But it's the idea that one person's crazy, and then they infect the other person with their crazy. So Peter hallucinated, maybe had a mental illness, and he really wanted Jesus to come back from the dead, and he hallucinated, and then he talked his craziness. He infected. He got the other. He pushed on the other disciples, and they fell for it too, and they saw it too, right? So shared delusion disorder. Now, the way that this works, the profile for how we've seen this work ever, is you have some sort of dominant person in the group, and then they're all kind of following this person. An example is cult groups. Cult groups are a thing. One of the more famous ones is the Heaven's Gate cult. I forgot what their real name is, but everybody calls them Heaven's Gate. But there was this comet that its orbit around the sun brought it close to the Earth in 96 or 95. I can't remember. I remember riding down the road and looking up, and people were like, "Hey Ben, there's the Hale-Bopp comet," and I was looking "Yep, there it is." Okay, it's kind of there it goes, and it was going by, and this group of people have been in this weird cult since the 70s, but they had somehow come to believe, and of course they had a leader, but they somehow came to believe that it was time for them to go up to, that was a spaceship they were going to go up to, and they all drank some poison and died, and one of them stayed alive and kept the website going, and it's this time capsule of mid-90s internet that's still there, and it's still going, because one of them stayed around to spread their message, and the rest of them all bought matching Nikes and committed suicide. And then the guy called the guy that was still there, called the cops. He's like, "Hey, they're all dead, come." And so it was this weird thing, and so that's a delusion. It's a fixed false belief. It's something that's not true, but they're not going to let go of it. It's fixed. Okay. Did they hallucinate? Well, a delusion doesn't have to be a hallucination. You can just be deluded into believing that you saw something in the past when you didn't actually see it. And you start thinking well, that sounds maybe that's what happened to the apostles. Right? Well, you've got to have, some hallucinations in there, because somebody's got to get this thing going, and so you're going to need a Peter hallucinator or something. But then you've got other problems, because Jesus' brother James and the Apostle Paul don't fit the profile. So for a cult group, I'll read you a story that I found online about another. It was just two women, or it might have been three, and they it was three sisters. They were they had this group psychosis or group delusion. Okay, so it says the lives of three sisters became increasingly enmeshed as adults, even though they had ordinary, respectable lives before spending all their time with only each other. They became increasingly concerned that their mother, who also suffered from mental illness, was going to hurt the three children of one of the sisters. They also became preoccupied with religion. The sisters stopped sleeping and became convinced that God was communicating with them. When the husband of one put a stop to them living in the same house, the women felt compelled to put on pajamas, take the 3 children, and drive to a house they believed God had given them so they could live together. They forced their way in, attacking the residents of the house and the attending police officers. The sisters were charged with multiple offenses and put in a cell together. There they took off all their clothes, refused to clean themselves, and performed religious rituals. They asked anyone who came through the door of the cell. They attacked anyone who came through the door of the cell. It took 2 hours for 15 officers to quiet the 3 sisters and cuff them. None of the sisters had a previous criminal record. They are no longer allowed to live near each other or visit without supervision. So group delusion, the thing about group delusion is it's the group that makes it work. It works through the group. And so if you have people who share in the delusion who are not members of the group, then that's not a group delusion. So and that there's this question of whether or not group delusion is even a thing. It's not officially a thing anymore. But you've got Paul and James who are not members of the group who believe it. Jesus' brother James, Mark 3:21 says that Jesus' family comes to get him because they think he's crazy. Okay? So the conversion of James and Paul to Christianity is evidence against the delusion. Okay? So in these theories you're going to need one hallucinator to start the delusion. And so you got Peter and then you got Paul, who both would have been how do you put it? Multimodal. And then we could say James was, we'll talk about James in a minute, but James, we could just say James was just visual, okay? And we'll see how this math works. John 7, we go to John 7. Alright, starting verse 1, after this, Jesus went around in Galilee. He did not want to go about in Judea because the Jewish leaders were there looking for a way to kill him. But when the Jewish festival of tabernacles was near, Jesus' brothers said to him, leave Galilee and go to Judea, so that your disciples there may see the works you do. No one who wants to become a public figure acts in secret. Since you're doing these things, show yourself to the world. For even his own brothers do not believe in him. Okay? And then later in John 19, at the crucifixion, Jesus sees his mama Mary and the disciple whom he loved, the writer of John, standing nearby. He said to her, woman, here is your son, and to the disciple, here is your mother. And from that time on, the disciple took her into his home. Given that Jesus had multiple brothers, and he wasn't comfortable leaving the responsibility for taking care of his mother to them, but rather to his disciple, tells us a lot about the relationship between Jesus and his brothers. Beep, beep. So, it might beep, beep again if I hit the wrong button. So, they were not in, in the correct frame of mind, and there's not much reason for this not to be historical here. The fact that Jesus' family thought he wasn't for real, but in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul straight up lists the appearance to James. In Galatians 1, Paul says that James is a leader in the church. I forget where it is he says. I think it's in Galatians 1. He says that James is Jesus' brother. Okay? In Galatians 1, Paul also tells us that the early Jerusalem church, when Christianity was there in Jerusalem and in Judea, in Israel, that church was persecuted, and violently so, because he says that he did it. So yes, the apostles already, right from the get-go, experienced violent persecution at the hands of Paul. So says Paul. He says to the Galatians that word had spread around. He had a reputation for that. that reputation is something that they could double check exists, and it seems unlikely that reputation would exist if it wasn't true. Like, I don't know who would have. All right, given that Paul's backing it up, so like this makes it another piece of historical evidence for the persecution of early Christians going all the way back. Okay. He also says in Philippians 3 and in 1 Corinthians 15 that he persecuted the early church. And in Philippians' case, we know that the apostles and Peter, that they witnessed them experiencing violent persecution. So, like, they knew the apostles. And so they could have, found out if that was true. Right? I mean, eventually they would have found out. And so it just stands to reason that word was spreading around, and the apostles were spreading around, and Christianity was spreading around, and Paul's not going to get away with lying about something like that. He says it in 1 Corinthians 15. He says he tried to destroy the church. He says that he zealously persecuted the church, and like the most natural reading of that is that he's a violent persecutor of the church. Even Bart Ehrman, the atheist historian, New Testament historian, says like, yeah, Paul violently persecuted the church. So that means James and the early church, Jerusalem church, endured violent persecution. Because what we know from Galatians is that James is like one of the early leaders in the church. So like, and we know from other historical sources, specifically the Romano-Jewish historian Josephus, that we talked about him in the video on the whether or not Jesus existed and was crucified. And he talks about how James was a leader in that church, and was that the high priest Ananias, when the governor Festus was dead and the replacement governor was en route, that Ananias trumped up some charges against James and some others, probably James's followers, and had him stoned. And because like that, I think they couldn't do that, but they would just do it sometimes, be naughty, and eventually they rebelled against Rome. Not long after that, and so like Josephus would have been a contemporary. He was like the son of a Pharisee living in this region at this time. Like, he was one of the people that fought in this rebellion later on. That wouldn't have come long after this, really, because this rebellion happened in 70 A.D., and, Jesus, like 36, 37, 35 A.D., crucifixion, appearance to James. You've got a pretty short window. That's probably about the time that Josephus was probably born, about the exact same time that Jesus ascended into heaven. So, like, he was in a position to know this. And usually the only doubt with anything that Josephus says is whether or not it was an interpolation by later Christians who like modified what he said. But in the case of this text, I don't know exactly why, other than to say that nobody contests this text about James being executed. This is not an interpolation. You can find it in Josephus's Antiquities of the Jews. It's usually called Antiquities, chapter 20. I don't know, is it book 20, chapter 1, verse 9? I'm not sure. At 20.1.9, how they do it, or it might be column 20, I don't know. But like, so anyway, this means that, we've got James here. Okay, so